Hi, everyone. So today we're talking about the Sweet Spot Project, but we're not only talking about the Sweet Spot Project. We plan to talk about what it means for producers. So we'll start off, Kieren will be talking about key benchmarks for breeder performance in Northern Australia, how to spot underperforming herds, what is past, then I'll talk for a bit, so we'll be swapping around a bit. What is pasture utilisation? Why do we care? How does pasture utilisation impact on reproduction, productivity and profit? Practical steps to assess and improve your herd. Financial benefits of optimising breeder performance. And then probably the bit that I'm most looking forward to today is the producer panel, where Michael Johnson and Grant Keane will be joining us to discuss their experiences when they've been making changes in the real world.
Thanks, Robyn. Can you hear me? I actually just got thrown out. I've just rejoined. Yep, awesome. Thanks, Robyn. And hello, everyone. I missed what Robyn just said, but I guess the Sweet Spot Project was a project that involved 22 commercial properties or stations and research stations. And we did a meta-analysis on annual reproductive breeder performance. And what that was is we collated a whole heap of data sets from those properties and analysed that in a standardised way. So what I'm presenting here in this first slide, just as a summary of the Sweet Spot Project outputs, which is the top figure with the graphic of Australia and some summary statistics there. Now, there was 78,000 breeders involved in that Sweet Spot data set, and we're also drawing on some of the information from the cash cow data set, that study was done in between 2009 to 2015. So just generally, there's probably not a lot of surprises that we found in these data sets that in the Sweet Spot. It was very consistent between these two studies. Generally, weaning rate in the Northern Forest was much lower than other regions. So weaning rate, which of course was percent of cows exposed, which might be different to what people see in their day-to-day recording. But in the Sweet Spot Project, we found that overall it was 66% in these more northern places. The cash cow data set said, or summarised that as about 56%. Now, we essentially the key finding, the key thing that we're trying to get across here is that, and what we were interested in the study is what role the pasture utilisation rate has in that. So when we're talking about these typical levels of performance, we're actually describing the 50%. So half of the mobs were performing greater than that, and the other half of the mobs were less than that. Now, I guess the key point is that people need to know their figures if they want to compare where they're at, and you can either do that at individual animal level, or you can do that using systems like herd flow, which Ian might mention later on. So some of the key things that we can pull out here is that calf loss was a major constraint, which we know in the Northern Downs and Northern Forest. So the Northern Downs is this dark brown area. That's typically around 15%, and in the green area, which is Northern Forest, it averaged around 18%. In breeders overall, calf loss was around 12%. The other major thing that we know influences herd productivity is reconception rate, or pregnancy within 4 months is how we've been measuring that. Now, what that statistic is once we fetal age a cow, we know which month she's expected to calve in, and then when she's tested next time, we back calculate to see whether or not she conceived within 4 months of having her last calf. Now, essentially, that's a summary of, does this cow contribute 2 weaners over 2 years or not? Now, what we can see from the Sweet Spot study is that typically 2 out of 3 cows achieve that, but in the northern forest, so the northern areas, it's only about 1 in 3. The other thing that was unique about the Sweet Spot project was that we were able to capture information from the central or the southern NT, which wasn't involved in the cash cow study. Now, what we found is that calf loss generally was a little bit lower in this region, but otherwise it typically performed very similar to the Northern Downs, the Barclay type situation. Rather than going on, we're trying to keep this presentation quite succinct. These studies that I'm referring to have got final reports and synthesis documents that will be uploaded and found on the MLA website, and I'm sure that there'll be links to those documents following today's presentation.
Okay, so what do we mean by pasture utilisation? It's the proportion of pasture that grows that is eaten by livestock each year. And you can see here that we've got pictures of what that looks like. So less than 5%, they've really just nibbled around the edges. They haven't chewed much off the tops. They're kind of eating in between this is Mitchell grass tussocks. 20%, you can kind of see they've hedged around a bit. And this is what we think is safe for Mitchell grasslands, generally speaking, Northern Australia. And you can see 50, 75% what that looks like. And you'll often see this near water or in drier years. So why does pasture utilisation matter? Well, it affects a lot of things. It affects land condition, individual animal performance, animal production coming out of a paddock, profit in the short term, as well as profit in the long term. And the way pasture utilisation affects this can actually be quite different in the short versus longer term. So previous studies in the sweet spot and cash cow found, sweet spot, found that at higher utilisation, you tend to get the highest individual animal performance, and as utilisation increases, individual animals don't do so well, so they grow less, they have fewer calves, etc. But as utilisation increases, so is the stocking rate. So when it comes to production coming out of the paddock, as you're increasing your utilisation, even though individual performance might go down a little bit, you often still have increasing production because you've got more animals in the paddock. What we wanted to know in the Sweet Spot project was, what is this optimum sweet spot of pasture utilisation? How can we master this balance between getting the utilisation right and maximising our long-term productivity coming out of these paddocks? So we wanted to know if we go to pasture utilisation above what we think is safe, are we just dropping off the rate of increase, or is it flattening off, we're getting no production out of these paddocks? Or over the longer term, are we actually starting to be worse off if we increase utilisation to those heavier levels? So pasture utilisation in Northern Australia, safe levels, we know that from past grazing experiments, but also more importantly, probably working with producers who have pastures in good condition and good stocking rate records, and we could go back through time and retrospectively model what levels of pasture utilisation they had been achieving to have this good sustained land condition. And it's actually pretty low for native pastures in Northern Australia. You can see that it might range from close to 0 in your hard spinifex, where there's not much palatable to eat, up to about 20 to 25% on your more productive, fertile, cracking clay soils. And that's because native pastures in Australia have not evolved with high levels of grazing, so they're not well adapted to grazing. If you give them high levels of utilisation, they tend to die out of the system and disappear. Now, it is different for improved pastures because they've come from regions where they've evolved with high levels of grazing. We haven't had herds of bison, buffalo, etc., driving the way our plants respond to grazing.
So I introduced before the variables that we were looking at. So annual pregnancy, we defined that by whether or not a cow was pregnant by the 1st of September or not. The reason we chose that date was if we determined that if they were pregnant by that time, that would allow them to contribute a weaner in the subsequent year. The other variables or the outcomes we were interested in was pregnancy within 4 months, which I described earlier, and weaning rate. So we undertook this exercise in looking at what factors, what what variables that we were able to have information on from this data set. So this we were reliant on information that had been recorded by other people. We weren't sort of in control of that, and we were investigating what information described variation in these reproductive performance outcomes. So you can see there on the table on the left, the ticks indicate that there was a strong association, a significant association between that term, that predictor, for a better word, and the outcome of pregnancy. So the main things that we found within pregnancy, within 4 months, with pregnancy, was animal class. So that's like a heifer versus a mature cow. Now, what is critical for people to, or what I would like to highlight, is that relative utilization rate was highly significant across all of the outcomes that we looked at. So when I say relative utilization rate, what I'm referring to is there's a recommended utilization rate of the pasture, and then we were able to calculate what was actually utilized of the pasture growth for that period of time. Now, if they had used twice the amount of pasture then would be recommended, that was a relative utilization rate of 2. So the other things that we found were highly significant was pasture and nutritional factors, particularly around the time of calf, were major determinants. So you can see there on the slide, the figure at the top center there, that is showing you the relationship between relative pasture utilization rate and annual pregnancy. Now the blue line is what the different lines are indicating. There's an interaction between Bos indicus content, and essentially what you can see there is that at the lower levels of utilization rate, so less than 1, there probably wasn't much of a change in reproductive performance for annual pregnancy. Once you exceeded that, there was a rapid decline in annual pregnancy, particularly in the areas or regions that had greater than 75% Bos indicus. Similarly, we see in the centre figure on the right there, on the right centre figure, you can see there that's pregnancy within 4 months by relative utilization rate, and across all of the different breed Bos indicus content levels, there's a general decline over increasing utilization rate. So if we take from there's high sensitivity of pasture utilization in low Bos indicus content, essentially. So it is a little bit of interest to us that when you look at the blue line, which is the green line, which is greater than 75% Bos indicus, it doesn't appear to be as sensitive to that increasing utilization rate as the other breed classifications. But that's of interest, and there may be other reasons that we weren't able to measure in this study associated with that. Increasing utilization rate from 1 to 2 from a weaning rate perspective, we estimated that was actually resulting in a 33% decline for the areas that had less than 50% Bos indicus, 16% decline in the moderate sort of Bos indicus content areas, and there was again sort of limited change with the regions that had a high Bos indicus content. So what is also quite interesting is that there was a very clear association with percent fetal and calf loss. So as you increased a relative utilization rate, there was a general increase in the predicted occurrence, rising between approximately 10 to 19%. So on average, each incremental increase in pasture utilization rate resulted in a 2.5 or 2.3% higher predicted calf loss occurrence. So maintaining pasture utilisation rate and managed stocking rates and nutritional strength, stress around the time of calving is likely to be associated with this response, we believe. So this is some of the other associations here, just generally descriptors. Animal class, which we know was important. Generally heifers, everyone's quite familiar, I suspect. We know that they typically have lower reproductive performance than other groups, particularly with pregnancy within 4 months, and also that they generally have a higher risk of calf loss. With body condition score, there is a very clear association with the benefits of managing body condition score. So, for instance, regardless of breed type, there were some very clear responses from body condition score measured at the preg test muster and annual pregnancy rate. When we were quantifying the effect of utilisation rate, there was a clear association between body condition score and the body and the level of utilisation rate. So body condition score at preg test. Why we were interested in measuring body condition score at the preg test muster is that it has been shown to be a stronger predictor for performance than measuring it at weaning, but they both have additive benefits when you're able to measure that. Highlighting that pasture growth and quality, particularly around the time of calving and while a cow was pregnant, was associated with increased performance. And there's some very clear responses with annual pregnancy. I can't see the figures at the bottom of this slide, sorry, but that, as you can see, their weaning rate is sort of showing a 20% incline there, just relative to the level of or nitrogen or pasture quality around that time of calving and pregnancy.
So back to pasture utilisation, we know from research that long-term heavy pasture utilisation leads to a decline in land condition. So it starts off with low ground cover, you're losing your palatable perennial grasses, and that results in you growing less grass per millimetre of rain that falls. This means you have a lower carrying capacity and it makes you less climate resilient. You tend to fall into an absence of plentiful forage sooner, your droughts will last longer, and you might recover from them more slowly. We looked at the long-term impacts of how high utilisation flows through, not only from how it affects land condition, but then also how it then flows through to production coming out of the paddock and profitability when we take into account the long-term impacts over decades of these high utilisation rates on pasture utilisation. And we used the bioeconomic model CLEM to do this. Lester Paul was the modeller from Queensland DAF. We found that the most profitable pasture utilisation over the long term was the highest stocking rate that you could carry that also maintained land condition. So we modelled this in 2 regions. We looked at in the Barkly and an imaginary property and also in Charters Towers. I'm going to show you Barkly results today. We modelled for 4 decades from 1979 to 2023, and each dot on these graphs represents the average outcomes over those 4 decades. On the left axis here, we've got the kilograms of beef produced per head, so individual animal performance as utilisation increases along the bottom axis. And on the y-axis, we've got what was the kilos produced of beef per kilometre squared. So what's the production coming out of the paddocks at different levels of utilisation. So the difference between what we're looking at here and the results that Kieren was looking at is this is the long-term impacts of pasture utilisation. Kieren was looking at what we found from the empirical data set, which was there is an impact of pasture utilisation on these breeder performance indices, but it's not dropping off as much as you're seeing this black line here. And the reason we find that over the longer term, the impacts of high utilisation are more severe than over the short term is because you're also including those impacts on land condition and then lower pasture growth over time at high utilisation rates. For the Barkly modelling, we told the model that the safe utilisation was 20%, and then we also told the model how much and how quickly pasture utilisation would change at pasture utilisation rates higher and lower than that level. And every single month, the model was modelling tens of thousands of animals in the Barkly property, working out, did they have enough to eat? What was the diet quality? How much did they eat? How much did they grow? Did they fall pregnant? Did they have babies? Did they die? So we could get this. It's a really interesting model. It also takes into account costs of production and also gives you then how does that flow through to profitability. We can see here that up to what we told the model was safe levels and a little bit beyond, you're not really dropping off much in individual animal performance per head, but above that it starts to drop off quite steeply. And this, remember, this is the average of over 40 years. And we gave the model the actual climate for Central Barkly. So it's running through sequences of drier years and wetter years that actually happened over that time period. Then the orange line there shows, well, how much beef was produced per area, because that's really what's driving productivity and profitability. And you can see that, again, up until what we told the model was safe, you're getting an increase in production out of that paddock. But after that, it didn't matter if you had more animals in the paddock and high utilisation rates, you weren't producing any more beef out of the paddock. And that's because the individual animal performance was so low on average. So if you managed to optimise your pasture utilisation rates, you weren't running out of feed as often, there was lower mortality in the herds, there was less costs of needing to sell at inopportune times when the markets weren't right and prices weren't favourable. You had less need to rebuild your herd because you didn't need to destock as much. You weren't getting reduced price per kilo due to poor body condition, less needing to feed during droughts and less supplementation costs. The model also followed then, well, how were the costs across these different utilisation rates? And you can see that as utilisation rate increases, you've got more animals, so costs are increasing. But in terms of profit, you really didn't increase much above, once you got too much above that 20%, you weren't producing any more kilos out of the paddock, but your costs were still increasing, so your profitability actually started to decline. Now remember, this is actually what's happening on average over the 40 years. So if you got your utilisation rates right, you got consistently high performance, you're producing more kilos per head, production out of the paddock was more consistent year to year, and you also got the highest profitability. Now, this is different to what you find if you're running a grazing trial for only a few years. And why is that? Because when you just, over the first few years, you're not getting those feedbacks on land condition. So you're still producing more beef and those high utilisation rates. But over the longer term, this modelling found, and it's the same as what they found at the Wombiana grazing trial, initially, really high stocking rates and utilisation gave you better outcomes. But once you start to get that decline in land condition as a result of those high utilisations, you suddenly were better off having utilisation levels around the safe level than higher than that. You might, if you worked out, okay, well, it looks like my breeder herd's underperforming, it might not necessarily be pasture utilisation. That's the factor that's driving that. There are other factors that are also potentially driving your breeder performance. So how do you know? Well, basically, we're really talking about, are your stocking rates more than recommended most of the time? And there's a number of ways that can happen. For a start, it might just be, well, are your stock numbers commensurate with the watered area and the accessible area in the paddock? So, for example, cattle spend 90% of their time within 4 kilometres from water. So if you had, for example, a paddock and you were putting in the number of animals for the whole paddock area, but actually they can only access half of it, that's going to result in very high utilisation for those cattle because they won't spend most of their time far from water or in those areas that they can't access or don't use very much. Similarly, sometimes we've come across people know what the carrying capacity is in terms of head, but they might not necessarily adjust for, well, actually, there's a different breed or class of animal that have a higher or lower intake, and that can also result in different pasture utilisation than what you're anticipating. So, for example, if you had a 100 square K paddock and you had a single water in it, the 4K radius of that is 50 square K. So actually only half of the paddock is really available for grazing. If you stock that paddock to its full area, then the animals are actually experiencing within that watered area double the utilisation rate, and then that's going to feed back on their breeder performance. It's also going to feed back on land condition close to water over time as well. Similarly, if you get your AE estimates wrong, then that can lead to under or over utilisation, utilising these paddocks. So what do you do if your stocking rates are more than recommended? There's a number of ways that you can address this. You can reduce stocking rates, and Kieren will talk a little bit about how you might do this strategically. Or you might try and improve your carrying capacity. So in large parts of the Northern Territory, probably not so much Queensland, there's often areas that are still unwatered, or they're only partly watered through semi-permanent waters. If waters can be added there, you'll be increasing your carrying capacity and decreasing the pasture utilisation so your breeders can perform better. You might try and get land condition recovery through lower stocking rates, through rotation involving spelling, potentially improve pastures. All these things obviously will have a cost, so you probably need to do a cost-benefit analysis. Then the other thing to think about too is if you have a highly variable climate, it might be useful to structure your herd so that you can adjust your numbers more easily seasonally. And I think Kieren and potentially our producers are going to talk about that today. Of course, all of this needs to know what is the carrying capacity for your property. Lucky for Queenslanders, they have this information available from the Long Paddock website. If they go to forage, for every single lot, you can get an estimated carrying capacity report. Here I've downloaded my old family property in southwest Queensland. They show you what is the long-term average here. It's 800 AE, and it shows you how that fluctuates through time due to seasonal differences. Then it also gives you, well, what's the carrying capacity for the different land types on the property, what's the median growth rate, and how does pasture condition also affect carrying capacity. In the Northern Territory, we don't quite have this wonderful service. We've got some land condition guides for some of the regions that spell out what's the safe utilisation rate, likely pasture growth, and safe stocking rate, and how that varies with land condition. But this is a gap in the NT, and we have some ongoing and current carrying capacity projects where we're hoping to fill in the gaps there.
So the next there's two slides coming up. These are not to be prescriptive or anything. These are just sort of possible ways that people could consider if they wanted to think about how they could manage animal equivalence or stocking rate. And obviously this is going to be something that's very individual to different enterprises and should be considered with economics and different things for each purpose. But generally, just for creating a discussion point of view, I suppose, is that some of the strategies that could be looked at or adopted is some of the very classic ones. You know, if you aren't already recording individual performance or ability to record performance overall, start identifying non-performers if you want to, cutting out those freeloaders on the property. The other way, the strategy would be segregating breeders into groups that are have similar nutritional requirements at similar times. Essentially, what we're trying to do here is identify groups that, if you've got a situation where your property is only all breeding females, or a high proportion of that enterprise is breeding females, and when the times get tough or things like that, you want to be able to make effective and timely decisions. So if you have your breeding herd segregated into your profitable groups, or your group of cows calving at the right time, potentially October, December, and January, February, and then March, April, and out of seasons, or you have your groups identified, and you can make management decisions and get rid of those animals when you need to. They're already much more simply, and you don't have to worry about processing or having calves at foot to deal with. I think that much of the industry is already doing this in many ways, but it is a strategy that can be used effectively to manage stocking rate over time. The other one, of course, is genetic improvement. Obviously, if you are able to select your bulls or your females and your heifers for reproductive performance. So they're actually, contributing more for the stocking rate or the pasture resource that they're utilising. And also consider what is your mature size. So we know that there are benefits in reproductive performance generally if you have a moderate framed cow versus a larger framed cow, but also from a grazing animal equivalent capacity by reducing that average frame of that cow. And this is a typical, you do have to consider your economic drivers in this process as well. But that is one way, is to review your genetic strategy and lowering your stocking rate that way. A simple way to do this might be crossbreeding or other strategies to do this. The other thing that is worth mentioning is that for properties that have to change or sell down females, if they are predominantly females, I mean, one of the strategies that should be probably considered is what is the right ratio of growers versus breeding females if they are in a very variable climate, and if they have to adjust stocking rates frequently. One thing is to have reconsidered potentially consider having a proportion of their mob trading animals and then breeding their own, or whatever proportion that they retain on property that allow that easy flexibility to move animals off and adjust their stocking rate. One other intervention that is not listed here, but is something else that should be or could be considered is diversification. So if there are either feedlots or grain or even improved pastures that allow more intensification of growth or improved growth rate, decreasing the turnoff of those trading animals, that also would reduce the grazing pressure on the overall property. But again, these are also strategies that are likely to be quite costly and would need to have a sound economic basis before undertaking them.
I'll just introduce our panel members before we kick off the next section. Kieren McLean is with Bush Agribusiness and also worked with NT-DAF based in Alice Springs in an earlier life. He has extensive experience working with producers across Northern Australia to understand factors driving their productivity and profitability. After we hear from Ian, we will be joined by our two producer panelists who are very experienced in managing grazing lands in the Northern Territory. We are joined today by Michael Johnson, General Manager of the Tipperary Group, and Grant Keane, General Manager of Australian Country Choice Properties, both of who have kindly agreed to share some of their experiences with us today and to round out the webinar. Over to you, Ian.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Melissa. I've just been asked to relate some of the findings from Sweet Spot to what we see in the business as we benchmark across the north. And there's a lot of same things coming through, which is good to see that are being sort of researched, reiterating what we see in practice. When we look at the performance of northern beef herds, the per animal productivity is the #1 profit driver. And when we're talking northern there, we're talking extensive rangeland businesses in the north where stocking rate isn't a profit driver. That's where they're reliant on the mostly native pastures, as Kieren and Rod have been talking about, and in regions where improved pastures can't easily be renovated or fertilised if the natural capacity of the country is exceeded. So where the stocking rate is the limit, or the carrying capacity is the limit, it's the kilos of beef produced per AE per year, which is a key measure, and that says how efficient those herds are at converting dry matter into live weight, that dry matter that's utilised that Kieren and Rob have been talking about. And the way to think about that, I think, is each AE is about 2.9 tonne of dry matter. So the question is, for your beef production system or your beef factory, how many kilos of beef are you getting for every 2.9 tonne of dry matter that goes into it? And when we look at businesses, it varies a hell of a lot, from about 60 to 120 for breeding businesses. Now, there's a big regional influence in that, obviously, where in the more productive areas it is higher, and in the less productive areas, generally the further north and west you go, it is lower. So there is inherent regional limitations, but even within regions, businesses side by side that might look the same from the outside can have big differences in the amount of kilos they produce just through having more efficient herds, higher reproductive rate, higher sale weight, lower mortality rate, and getting their stocking rate right for their carrying capacity is a big part of that. And it's the kilos of beef per AE, that efficiency of the herd, which really drives income. When we line up all the businesses in terms of what their performance is, it's those businesses that have the most productive herds that generate the most income in the long term, because they're trucking out more kilos of beef for every animal they're running. Price received is important, and we've all seen in the last few years the impact price has year to year. It is important, but when we look at the long-term data, we see price affecting the results year to year, but not business to business. It's still, in any market and in the long term, it's those businesses that are most productive that do have the highest income in the long term. So that's the income side of it, driven by the per animal productivity, so getting that right. When we look at costs, and this has already been covered off on a bit, costs are largely determined by the number of animals run. So when we have a look at the direct costs or variable cost or enterprise expenses, your lick, your animal health and things like that, the more animals you have, the more those costs are. When we do look at that, we do see the better performers do target their herd expenditure better, but they do get more in terms of productivity, so that's better targeted. The overhead costs are largely a function of the number of people you've got running around, but the number of people you've got running around is largely a function of the number of animals. So costs do go up effectively with the number of animals, but that labour efficiency is a key measure, and our data's found that needs to be about 1,500 AE per FTE or greater just to have competitive costs. So if we stand back and have a look at it and say that the per animal productivity drives income, and we need to manage the number of animals we've got to maximise that per animal productivity, as we saw in those graphs Robyn showed before, and if costs keep going up as we have more and more animals, then profit is maximised when enough animals are run that doesn't limit animal performance, so that we're getting most out of each animal and not pushing the environment to the point that affects land condition, which will impact your carrying capacity in the long term. And you can, and people do, and we see this, try and push numbers beyond that, thinking, well, if I'm running more, I'm getting more. But as Robyn alluded to, this increases the exposure to seasonal variability. Eat yourself into drought sooner, takes longer to come out of it. And one thing we really see coming through clearly from long-term data is those businesses, particularly the northern breeding businesses, that are able to have more stable numbers in the long term. Numbers do, it's a variable game. Agriculture, it's always up and down a bit, but there's some businesses that are much more stable than others through having good management, good plans, and their numbers set appropriately for the carrying capacity. They have better and more consistent long-term performance and better land condition as well, which really has a positive effect on their business. Therefore, the way we sum this up is run as many as you can, but no more than you should, which is effectively that sweet spot. So trying to find that for your business is the key. Now, that's the challenge for managers, to know where that is. And as was alluded to, getting the herd profile right there, knowing your long-term carrying capacity, I think, is a key part of that. Setting your plan around that in the long term, and then having your herd profile set up to maximise the sale weight and kilos produced for your production system, the productivity of your country and your available markets, I think, is key. And that's what we see from the data. So something that will help with this is we've invested over the last couple of years with MLA in a platform to gather this high-level herd data. There's lots of paddock and crush side level packages out there to collect herd data, which are very good, but we've seen that there's a bit of a gap for something above that to look at the big picture to help work out how many AE are run, how much kilo of live weight's produced, what the reproductive rate and mortality rate is. So we've put this together primarily for the businesses that we benchmark, but it is also available to MLA members through the MyMLA website for a trial for 12 months of data through that. So you can find that through our website or through MyMLA or Future Beef. So that's me. Thank you, Melissa.
Okay, we will be beginning our producer panel session now. So I'd like to invite Grant and Michael, as well as Ian, and I will put you over to Robyn to begin the session.
We've got a series of questions here just to prompt Grant and Michael. The first one is, what were you seeing in your herd and pastures that made you consider making changes? And was it a trend over time, or was it a particular seasonal event?
I think what we started to see first of all was production decline, and principally that was through higher stocking rates. If you go back to the 18, 19, 20, 21 years, they were quite dry across the north in most regions, coming off the back of better years before. So we had this inventory build, a real push for numbers equals profit. But as the seasonality started to get a little bit drier, I think not reducing stocking rates at the right time frame in consideration of season really started to see production decline, and then as a result pasture decline, cost base goes up when you think about supplementation and trying to maintain animals on those poor quality pastures. And then I think from a seasonal perspective, I think that stocking rate really just exacerbated the season. So there's no doubt that it was very, very dry and droughted in some respects, but the decline was exacerbated by the stocking rate.
Did you have any comments?
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, no, thanks, Rob. For me, what really probably brought this home, I actually came at it from a pasture land condition angle. So I returned to a property after 7 years, come back to manage it after 7 years after I'd first worked on it, and I got a real shock when I come to this environment and sort of seen a degradation of land condition. And it's probably took me a while to tie herd performance per se back into that land condition, but what it became quite apparent is like how resilient, just to what Michael alluded to, we ran into some, tail end of some, half ordinary seasons decline into some pretty ordinary ones. And, you could just see the resilience of your AB land condition was just so much stronger. And the ability, these days I'd use the term rainfall effectiveness, was that, per 100 millimetres of rain, kilos of grass or dry matter grown was just so much stronger in the higher land condition thing. So that's where I really probably come from my perspective, and agree completely with all the statements about, as we build our herd and inventory up, rolling into those drier times, trying to maximise profitability was a bit of a perfect storm.
Yep. So tell us about what changes you made, Michael and Grant.
Yeah, I think the first thing was to sit back, and Grant alluded to land conditions. So first of all, let's go out and undertake the assessments, and where do we actually sit at this point in time, and what does the improvement need to look like? From a herd perspective, what are we trying to achieve? And each business will be different, there's no doubt, whether you're in a bigger integrated supply chain or you're a straight out trading operation, but what does your herd mix need to look like? And I think it was touched on in some of Kieren's presentation earlier, making the change to having some more trading cattle within the within the herd, rather than going heavy breeders and not being able to, you know, reduce stocking rates as easily because the animals aren't as marketable or body condition challenges, etc. Having that relief valve in getting a balance of trading animals that you can get off as you move into dry times, also spread some of your cash flow throughout the year. That was probably one of the key ones. And then thinking about the sustainability of well, the rebuild, I guess, of land condition and the sustainability of production within the herd, probably taking a backward step and going, well, let's stock even below what is, you know, the desired carrying capacity and or stocking rate, and give ourselves a little bit more relief. So took a 80% of long-term carrying capacity approach, and then as land condition improves, then look to find what that sweet spot is. So is it 90%? Is it 100%? What is it? And then having that trading herd to do those seasonal adjustments, I think, was really important. That was probably the big one.
Grant?
Yeah, completely agree with all that, Michael. For me, when I sort of first started on this sort of stuff, I didn't necessarily was able to manage the entire, you know, herd structure or the or the overall, like, you know, number of head on the property I was managing. So to me, I sort of more started, you know, how could I, you know, in my day-to-day, you know, management of a place, just start to make small changes and start to experiment as my sort of opinion grew and strengthened. And I started playing around with just, you know, shutting waters off and things like this, trying to impact graze. You know, as you commented on, Robyn, your utilisation rate in the 100 square K paddocks are really good example. And then that sort of, as it matured, grew into, I started to, you know, probably knock paddocks together a bit more aggressively in the growing season and trying to really drive wet season spell. You know, again, focus mainly on land condition. And then as it sort of matured and evolved, I started to tie my management decisions or you know, just normal mustering practices, sales practices back into paddock shifts and moves, and started to, you know, very strategically, but started to plan and think about this a bit more to try and tie the herd management and pasture management together into one sort of thought process. You're in the north, right? So you're pretty, you know, restricted by infrastructure in a lot of cases. So, you know, just trying to play around, you know, you're not going to, you know, do like a stall graze thing in our environment. So just what we could do gently to try and make little changes was where I started to play. And then understanding, you know, different, you know, when you move into a more extensive versus intensive region that's less developed, something like that, again, how can you just sort of work with what you got rather than, you know, trying to make it do something that it's really not going to do. So that's probably the changes I started with, and completely agree with that, you know, that what Kieren and Michael both said about that, lifting our dry stock percentage and just making ourselves, you know, more able to move quickly with a change in seasons. So critical once you're able to, you know, manage your herd composition.
Yep. So Michael, what were the unexpected challenges or unanticipated benefits you found when you undertook these changes?
Yeah, I'll probably focus on the benefits because I'm not sure there was too many challenges apart from probably what most of us know, in that in a lot of these extensive environments we have ultimately larger paddock size. Whether they're well watered or not well watered, we still have challenges around cattle grazing habits. But I think you know, that typical, you know, overgrazing one area of the paddock, even though you might have stocked the paddock adequately for what its carrying capacity is. I think one of the benefits is by bringing those numbers back, it really took away the pressures that you would get on a lot of those areas that potentially had been overgrazed in the past. So behaviour did start to change in better spread, more movement, because there's a little bit less competition for feed, and so you start to get these a little bit more selective grazing, which often is a big driver of productivity. The performance in the herd, huge changes in the performance in the herd, both from a fertility perspective, flows on to, you know, lactation, and then the calf raising and higher weaner weights. And this is, you know, coming out of the back of dry season, so not necessarily just off the back of a few good seasons. This is getting stocking rate right in the drier seasons and then building through. Things like supplements, less competition with less numbers, so I think more adequate intakes across the whole herd, which I'm sure has a production benefit as well. And then the other thing, I think, the unanticipated benefits, the ability for country to actually recover if you can spell stock lighter where you need to, rotate around like Grant alluded to. It is amazing how country can recover if you have the patience.
Yep. Grant?
Yeah, agree with all that. Probably you focusing on the benefits first is you know, the reduced stocking rates or utilisation rates. Agreed with you know, seen on several occasions where, you know, overall head number, AE number has been reduced, but the same kilos of beef per AE, you know, has been turned off time and time again, or same branding rate, sorry, which has increased kilos of beef per turned off. So you know, that's just critical. And you know, and I've just seen the churn disappear out of businesses, if that makes sense, where we have high utilisation rates. You know, we're just falling into the next wet season, only just getting there with our stocking rates, and you know, and then with high supplementation, high paddock moves, things like that are creating work, and just backing that back off took a lot of the pressure out of those systems and really stabilised them. One challenge I've seen, particularly if, you know, once you get a bit excited about changing your grazing patterns or something, you want to try and get in a, you know, a good even graze or something like that, is, you know, particularly, and I'm sort of probably referring to like gamba grass country in the north or things like that, where we, you know, we were very focused on managing the gamba, knocking it down low, but you know, we sacrificed areas where there wasn't gamba and had a you know, backward impact to land condition and those things. So we had to really learn that balance between getting a, you know, strong utilisation rate, you know, versus spelling and stabilising some of those more fragile areas, which again is such a challenge in the northern environment with the, you know, many different land types through it. So that's probably all I had, Robyn.
Yep. So Michael and Grant, can you give us an idea of how your key kind of indicators change? Like how did it affect weaning rate or the kilos you're getting out of the paddock when you made these changes?
Yeah, well, we certainly, and I'm talking over a fairly large landscape and area, but and a fair bit of geographical diversity too. But you know, fertility rates, steady incline, and starting to stabilise out, you know, up around the sort of, you know, 75 to 80% breeding rates over longer term averages. Weaning weights up 30, 40 kg. So yeah, just huge moves. I think there's a bit of test case in some of the stuff that I undertook in as we move back to some dry seasons. Do we hit all the triggers, and do we make sure that we make the right decisions around, you know, turning some more of those trading cattle off early enough to ensure that we maintain adequate production? The other thing, I think, where we were perhaps in the thought process that cows calving right throughout the year, and the winter calvers were probably easier to try and manage them into those tighter calving groups that sat within the wet season when nutrition was a little bit better. Found that production rates within, you know, cows calving through the winter were as good as some of those cows calving through the wet season when nutrition was supposedly better. So that spread of animals throughout the year, particularly when you're in a supply chain type methodology where you're, you know, providing every week, actually had that upside as well. So probably the key things, yeah.
Grant?
Yeah. For me, I don't think there's any one silver bullet or one metric to focus on as a producer. Like it's a, you know, at the risk of using buzzwords, holistic sort of type thing. You got to take into account many of these different metrics. So I really like, that being said, I really like the kgs of beef per AE, you know, that Ian speaks about. That's one that I think is and kgs of beef per hectare is such an important, you know, true north to focus on. And then you know, for me, for someone trying to go down this sort of path is you know, there's not sort of one size fits all. It's all about the principle of what you're trying to achieve rather than the method, and you know, getting around and seeing lots of different ideas and things like that. And you know, you don't need to cookie cutter something from one section and try and do it, you know, in a different section. You know, you just blend it and adapt it to the environment you're in. You can back off segregation or land management, whatever it is, and make it simpler or more intense depending on the environment and the economic benefit you can generate out of it. So that's probably the point I'd make.
Yep. So yeah, to the last question, I mean, any helpful hints? What would you tell producers who are thinking about going down this path? And Ian, you might have some thoughts as well.
Plan, monitor, measure, and be patient. It's probably the key, and it's hard to predict weather. Be prepared to make the decisions and move, knowing that you know, should you encounter what could end up being a dry time, if you've made the right decisions based on pasture-based land conditions earlier, you'll have cash in the bank and the ability to restock quicker or whatever it is, depending on the environment you're in. But I think that planning, monitoring is really important, and measure business.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And yeah, trusting the process, as Michael says, you need patience. It will take time. That's where I think you got to look at, you know, what data's out there. I think stuff you've got from Sweet Spot, from Wombiana, like there's a lot of stuff out there which indicates this is the case, but it can take a while to see results. And to see results, you need to measure what matter. I think some people are still used to measuring things in terms of the number of breeders they're running or the number of head they're running. But if they start thinking about, you know, the number of weaners they're producing or the kilos they're producing, then that's going to be key. You know, do the forage budgeting process as well and make sure they're matching supply and demand. You know, if you're having to lighten off numbers, it's a great time at the moment to be lightening off numbers. So, you know, value adding those sales, getting animals out of the system, and if you're making sure everything gets as much as possible. And also, I think in all of this, Kieren made the point, you know, make sure the genetics you're tipping in is going to complement what you're doing in the nutrition side or the grass side of it to take you forward as well.
Thanks very much. That's really interesting. Good insights.
Yeah, thank you, Robyn, and everyone on the panel. That was a awesome conversation, and great to have producers speaking about their experiences and how they're applying all of the information that they can record and manage.